You know, deep inside your brain, right now, there's this incredibly powerful, kind of hidden system. It acts like the ultimate gatekeeper for all of your movements, deciding what you do and, just as importantly, what you don't do. So today, let's take a journey into the basal ganglia and see how it shapes every single move you make. All right, let's just dive right in with a real clinical case from our source material, because I think it makes this whole thing so much clearer. It all starts with something that sounds pretty minor, right? A 58-year-old man, a slight tremor in his left hand. But this is the very first clue in a neurological puzzle that we are going to solve together. So the neurologist starts to observe, and more clues appear. The tremors, they're really specific. They happen when his hand is just resting, but as soon as he tries to do something, they stop. Interesting. He's also moving all his limbs really slowly, and his face, it doesn't show much expression. When he walks, it's this kind of shuffling, stooped posture. And when the doctor tries to move his arm, she feels this weird, slight jerky resistance. See, these aren't just random symptoms. They're all pointing to one specific area of the brain. So to figure out what's happening to this man, we have to go deeper. We need to move past the symptoms on the outside and find the cause on the inside. Let's head into the brain's control room to track down the source of the problem. And here we are. The source of the issue is almost certainly in the basal ganglia. Now, as our source defines them, these are basically big clusters of neurons, gray matter, that are buried way down deep in the brain. Now, they aren't the ones that shout the initial command to move, but they are absolutely essential for controlling and fine-tuning those movements. This diagram here shows us exactly where we're looking. You see all those wrinkly folds on the outside? That's the cerebral cortex. But the basal ganglia, highlighted right here, they're tucked way deep inside. And that central location, it's key. It lets them act like a central hub, getting and refining movement signals from all over the brain. Okay, a quick heads up, you're going to hear a few different names for these structures, and honestly, it can get a little confusing. This table just breaks down how scientists group them together. Think of corpus striatum as the big team name, and the others are just specific players on that team. The main thing to remember is they all work together as one big integrated system to control movement. Don't get bogged down in the names. So, we know what they are, and we know where they are, but how do they actually work? This is where that whole gatekeeper idea really starts to make sense. I mean, think about it for just a second. Right now, your brain is just flooded with potential movements. You could be tapping your fingers, shifting in your seat, scratching your nose, getting up to walk away. How does it pick the one right action while telling all those other possibilities, nope, not now? Well, that selection process, that's the number one job of the basal ganglia. Now, and this is crucial, the basal ganglia don't do this alone. As you can see in this diagram, they're locked in this constant feedback loop. So the motor cortex, think of it as the brain's CEO, sends down a rough draft, an idea for a movement. The basal ganglia then act like the ultimate editors, refining that plan, making sure it's perfect, before sending the approved version back up. It's a constant conversation. And that whole editing process really has two main jobs. On one side, it gives the green light. It helps start and smooth out the movements you actually want to make. But on the other side, it gives the red light. It actively puts the brakes on and blocks all those competing unwanted movements. It's this incredibly delicate, constant balancing act between go and no-go. So if you remember one thing, it's this. The basal ganglia don't invent movement out of thin air. They take those rough drafts from the cerebral cortex and they refine them. They modulate the signals to make sure the final action is smooth, controlled, and exactly what you intended. But what happens when that master editor, that gatekeeper, starts to fail? What happens when that delicate balance between go and no-go gets completely broken? Well, that's when we see these profound and, honestly, often devastating movement disorders. And these failures typically fall into two main categories. On one hand, you have hypokinetic disorders. Hypo means less, and they involve a lack of movement or slowness. The go signal is just too weak. Parkinson's is the classic example here. On the flip side, you have hyperkinetic disorders. Hyper means more. In this case, the no-go signal, that red light, fails, and that leads to all these excessive involuntary movements. For Parkinson's specifically, scientists have really pinpointed the problem. It's a breakdown in a specific connection called the nigrostriatal pathway. And this pathway runs on a chemical messenger, a neurotransmitter called dopamine. The easiest way to think about it is that dopamine is the gas for the go signal. If you have less dopamine, you just don't have enough gas to get movements started smoothly. And we're not talking about a rare disorder here. This one specific system failure affects about 1 million people in the United States alone. That's a million lives that are completely changed because this single, delicate system deep inside the brain isn't working the way it should. So, now that we're armed with this understanding of how the system works and how it can fail, let's go back to our patient and put these last few pieces of the puzzle together. So let's connect the dots back to his symptoms. This diagram shows us that broken pathway. The go signal for movement is basically getting stuck. Because that nigrostriatal pathway isn't delivering enough dopamine, the entire system is dampened down. His brain is hitting the accelerator, but the engine just isn't getting enough fuel. And that's why we see the slowness, the lack of expression, and even those tremors at rest. And so, by connecting the patient's very specific symptoms to her deep knowledge of how the basal ganglia are supposed to work, the neurologist can confidently make the diagnosis. It's Parkinson's disease. The puzzle is solved. So why does all this matter? Well, the bottom line is that the basal ganglia act as our brain's subconscious editor, constantly working behind the scenes to make our movement smooth and purposeful. When this system breaks down, the impact is just severe. But the more we understand these incredibly intricate circuits, the closer we get to finding better and better treatments for these conditions. And I'll leave you with one last kind of fascinating thought. It turns out these same feedback loops, these same gatekeepers, they don't just control movement. They're also deeply involved in shaping our thinking and our emotions. They're gatekeepers for more than just our muscles. They might also be gatekeepers for our very thoughts and feelings. Which really makes you wonder, what happens when those gates start to break down?